Alright, so for my presentation, I will be going over my second essay, which went over trans rights. Before I get into the presentation, I'd like to say that the reason why I chose this topic is because one of my best friends from middle school is transgender, and I believe that her validity is important and it's crucial to understand. Science updates all the time, and there is irrefutable data that proves that transgendered people or transness is valid. Also, I think it's really interesting to view the social construct of gender and also just to see how science updates over time to more predictable models of society. So, our thesis statement. There is irrefutable scientific data that supports the validity of trans and non-binary people. Discrimination against transitioning in healthcare is discourteous because it hurts the representation of trans individuals. So this is more of a focus on discrimination in the healthcare system, and later on we talk about transitioning surgery and how the results of some people hurts the representation and really just the idea of what being trans is. It doesn't distinguish gender dysphoria between sexual dysphoria, and I think we get into that later on. So my introduction, let me get this out of the way somehow. Alright. Trans ideology, the idea that gender and the syntax are a product of social conditions, not biological characteristics. Most women are 46XX and most men are 46XY. However, research suggests that in a few births per thousand, some individuals will be born with a single sex chromosome and some will be born with 3 or more sex chromosomes. We can all understand how important it can be to identify with certain fundamental aspects of a character, but this is more important if you're oppressed. So it's saying that people are actually born non-binary, intersex people most definitely exist, but even if you have, certain equipment to a sex, doesn't necessarily mean that biologically you would be considered a male or a female. There's a lot more that gets into it. So my pro arguments for this would be that we interpret social phenomena and continuously update our understandings of the world. This is what it means to be an educated person. Gender is not a fundamental facet of human nature. Societies have had different understandings of gender, ways of describing gender, and numbers of gender for a long time. This can go into indigenous tribes and how, like for example, in the Philippines, there's gendered based on your energy, but then also your sex. So you could be a male but then have female energy. You could be a female and have masculine energy, or you could just be, your sex and your same energy. When we look at less permanent changes with hormone blockers, it's difficult to find examples of people regretting their treatment. This is no long-term damage and is a quick return to where you would be otherwise. So with hormone treatment, that's going to block your growth before you hit puberty. So if you're a child that is showing strong signs of being trans, you can get these blockers that will hold off the puberty, and you can then decide, all right, I want to stay as my sex, or I want to transition into the opposite sex. And nothing drastic happens other than just being more of an androgynous kid. But mental growth and whatnot, that's not gonna affect it. They found that discrimination they faced for being transgender was so severe that they would have preferred to live with their dysphoria. So going into the con arguments. what this is saying is that after the surgery, they would have rather stayed as their own sex, and that it just made it more confusing. But we can get into the counter arguments for these. Next one is parents describe that the onset of gender dysphoria seems to occur in the belonging to the peer group where one, multiple, or even all friends have become gender dysphoric and transgendered identity during the same time frame. So it's definitely true for younger kids. Peer pressure is a huge factor in deciding what you want to be when you grow up. And yes, I mean, there are possibilities where maybe you're trying to discover what your sex is. Maybe you have a friend who is transgender and you start to think about your own gender identity. But let's move on to our counterclaim. So for the first study, Cecilia Denhe tries to study to indicate the sexual reassignment surgery harms people, increases suicide. The control group used for post-transition trans people was cisgender people. The method in which they talked about it reinforced the narrative that tons of trans people regret their transition and now trying to jump back, which is not valid. And then for the second study, generally speaking, we do not use a small group of people who regret it as an argument against the totality, unlike Lisa Littman. Most marriages end in divorce, but we still encourage people to get married. A fraction of a percent of people regret transitioning. This is meant to be an argument against other folks who have transitioned and are happy with it. My conclusion is that almost every reputable psychological and biological organization in the developed world recognizes the existence and validity of trans people. Thousands of scientists who dedicate their lives to the study of human mind agree that trans people not only exist, but also that their transness is valid and a component of their identity, not a delusion. Trans individuals deserve to have the same protections of healthcare as anyone else. Actions against the treatment of detransitioning are unproductive and harmful to our communities. Thank you for listening.